To order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. Votes have been moving around a little bit, something my friend is familiar with. Good afternoon. We're meeting today to conduct a hearing entitled Examining China's Coercive Economic Tactics. Today's hearing covers a topic that's of great importance to the United States. It's indisputable that the People's Republic of China has repeatedly used economic coercion to shape their policies or to exact retribution in response to sovereign decisions Beijing does not like. These practices run counter to the international trade system that has been in place for the past 75 years. They also harm U.S. interests around the world, undermine the sovereignty of free and independent nations, and have damaged the economies of our partners and friends. Chinese economic coercion tactics take many forms. Some are as blatant and public as unilateral weaponized use of trade sanctions and embargoes for China's economic and business advantage. Others are more subtle, ranging from undercutting international access to the Chinese domestic market and exerting pressure on commercial investment deals to the quiet imposition of other trade restrictions on companies seeking to do business in or with China. As we consider this question, we must remember that unlike the United States, the lines between China's government and Chinese business entities are blurred. The Communist Party of China, the People's Liberation Army, and indeed the overall government of the People's Republic of China are heavily involved in the Chinese economy. This allows China to put not just a thumb on the scales, but a heavy weight in favor of the interests of the Chinese state. The tactics of economic coercion China uses pose a clear threat to American economic stability, to our national security, and to those of our friends and allies around the world. Rather than adhering to the rules of the road that most other countries around the world follow, China is instead choosing to rewrite those rules in its favor. In doing so, they threaten the stability of critical supply chains, fair and free access to markets the world over, and even the continued sovereignty of neighboring nations. Today's hearing does not arise in a vacuum. It's part of a bipartisan effort by the House of Representatives to examine America's relationship with Communist China and the urgent threat to the United States and our allies posed by the Chinese Communist Party. Earlier this year, the House created the Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party, a bipartisan effort to examine these questions. As this process moves forward, I look forward to discussing possible legislative priorities, including H.R. 1135, the Countering Economic Coercion Act of 2023, which I joined with Representative Gregory Meeks, the ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and with other members on both sides of the aisle to introduce in March. This bipartisan bill will extend new tools to the administration to counter foreign adversaries using economic coercion to pressure, punish, and influence U.S. allies and partners. Specifically, it will provide targeted relief to our allies subjected to economic coercion through decreased duties on goods, export financing, and loan guarantees. Additionally, it would increase duties on imports from those engaging in economic coercion. I look forward to continuing to work with Ranking Member Meeks and a bipartisan coalition of members on this bill. I want to extend a warm welcome to our witnesses who are appearing before us today and to thank them for sharing their time and expertise with us. I also want to thank our Ranking Member, Mr. McGovern, and his staff for working closely with us to make today's hearing happen. While the Rules Committee is often the setting for partisan combat, I expect we will not see that today. The thorny questions we're considering today are ones that vex and concern us all, Republicans and Democrats alike. Indeed, there's no stronger message that we can send to China than one that shows that both parties are united on this question. Before I turn it over to Ranking Member McGovern for his comments, I want to remind our members that while we do not have time limits during the hearing, in an effort to be respectful to our witnesses and the time commitments of our members, I'd like everyone to try, if possible, to keep statements or questions to around 5 minutes. We have one witness who has a hard stop at 4:30 today, and we certainly need to conclude our hearing by then. I now want to yield to my good friend, a distinguished ranking member of the Rules Committee, Mr. McGovern, for any remarks he cares to make.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me start by commending you and your team for pulling together this hearing in a constructive and in a very collaborative manner. You know, when we were in the majority, you were very gracious in working with me as we did a series of hearings focused on the issue of hunger in America. And I am glad to repay that goodwill on this important issue. And again, it's been a pleasure to work with you and your team in preparation for today's hearing. Today's original jurisdiction hearing is in response to an important problem: the use of economic coercion by the People's Republic of China. I am glad that this issue is gaining traction, and I hope that this hearing leads to important dialogue and progress toward action. This is not a new problem. By some accounts, China has been employing economic coercion since reopening its foreign trade and investment in the 1980s. But as Xi Jinping's power has grown, so has China's use of many different tactics of economic conversion, from ad hoc trade restrictions and popular boycotts to tourism restrictions and administrative discrimination against companies and states. What's frustrating is that China can do this stuff because its businesses are state-owned or state-tied. They operate in an environment that's very constrained, if not fully controlled, down to the corporate level by the PRC. Generally speaking, America and our allies and partners don't work this way. We're not set up in a way that allows us to respond tit for tat, nor should we want to. So we need to develop a comprehensive response that is strategic and agile and also gets the government of China to cut it the hell out. Many of us have been paying attention to this problem and have taken action. I co-chaired a Congressional Executive Commission on China hearing on China's use of economic coercion in December 2021 that came up with several recommendations for reducing vulnerability by reducing dependence on Chinese supply chains and markets. Recent legislation like the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act will help the U.S. reduce its own vulnerability to China's economic coercion by diversifying away from China in semiconductors and electric vehicles. Anyone concerned about China's coercive tactics should be supporting full and fast implementation of these laws. In addition, the Countering Economic Coercion Task Force authorized in the FY 2023 NDAA will review all the tools currently available to the U.S. government to counter China's bad practices and come up with recommendations to proactively deter this behavior, and I'm looking forward to those recommendations. I hope the discussion today will contribute to the ongoing effort to strengthen our capacity and that of our allies to counter China's economic coercion. Although our discussion today will focus on China, and although China is by far the world's worst offender when it comes to economic coercion, it is important to remember that the definition of economic coercion is broad. It covers a long list of bad practices that governments other than China's could also engage in. And it's important for us to target the practices rather than the country. By the way, in case anyone thinks that only the PRC engages in this kind of behavior, let me mention an example from here in the United States. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis' targeted campaign of government retaliation against companies like the Disney Corporation that don't toe his ideological line. The temptation to use state power to coerce private sector companies or other governments or levels of government is not limited to China. And I hope that we can see a little bit more ideological consistency when it comes to these issues. I also want to emphasize the importance of multilateral approaches to countering economic coercion. One of the main recommendations that came out of the 2021 CECC hearing was that the United States should work together with its allies and partners so that the responses to economic coercion would be more effective. The European Union is going in this direction. It just adopted an anti-coercion policy to support member states that are subject to economic coercion. China is an economic powerhouse. We counter that not with tit-for-tat sanctions or a trade war, but with our own economic power. And with that, I look forward to today's discussion, and I yield back my time.
Thank you very much for your comments. Once again, I'd like to welcome our witnesses in the Rules Committee today. We appreciate each of them taking the time from their busy schedules to share with us their expertise on this important topic. Without objections, witnesses' written testimony will be made part of the record. Our first witness is Dr. Victor Cha. Dr. Cha is the Senior Vice President for Asia and Korea Chair with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Dr. Cha, welcome to the Rules Committee. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Cole, Ranking Member McGovern, and members of the committee for allowing me to participate in this hearing. And this is a very important topic. My comments today are my own and don't represent the views of the Department of Defense, CSIS, or Georgetown. China's economic coercion has become part and parcel of its foreign policy against many trading nations. Targets of this weaponization since 2008 number over 18 countries and over 123 companies, precipitating tens of billions of dollars in economic damage. From China's perspective, this coercion works. After sanctioning South Korea's Lotte company in 2016 and embargoing imports of German pork in 2020, both countries remained silent when China passed the national security law in Hong Kong, suppressing democracy. Brazil did not exclude Huawei from its 5G auction for fear of losing billions of dollars in business. After a Chinese ban on Norwegian salmon in 2010, the country's leaders refused to meet with the Dalai Lama when he visited in 2015. And after Taiwan opened a representative office in Vilnius in 2021, Lithuania saw a 91% decrease in exports to China. The list goes on and on. You know these cases very well. Dealing with China's weaponization of trade is a critical prerequisite for the success of the administration's strategic competition with China. The willingness of countries to sign up to supply chain coalitions or to support Taiwan's defense depends on how fearful they are of Chinese economic retaliation, because no country can truly decouple from one of the largest economies in the world. The United States and like-minded partners need to consider a new collective resilience strategy to deter Chinese economic coercion. How does collective resilience work? Most of the targets of Chinese economic coercion are asymmetrically trade dependent on it, but this should not obscure the reality that many of these countries also export items to China upon which the Chinese market is highly dependent and in some cases almost 100% dependent. For example, China is over 90% dependent on the import of silver powder from Japan, which it uses to make solar panels. The next two suppliers of silver powder to China are the United States and South Korea, making up nearly 100% of their dependence on these countries. China is over 80% dependent on the import of Kentucky bluegrass seed from the United States to sow its soccer fields. The next largest exporter of this is Denmark, again comprising together almost 100% of grass seed imports. China is nearly 100% dependent for a luxury good, that is whiskey, from the UK and Japan. So the list goes on and on. Indeed, the 18 countries that are previous and current targets of Chinese economic coercion export over $46 billion worth of goods to China, upon which the country is more than 70% dependent, and over $12 billion in goods upon which China is more than 90% dependent. These countries can band together and practice economic deterrence by promising collective retaliation in the trade space on these high dependence goods should China act against any member of the collective. Forcing China to find a new supplier or pay a higher price for one item, like whiskey, for example, is not going to be enough to change China's behavior. However, joining together in an Article 5 type collective economic defense framework could threaten enough inconvenience for China that it might deter future predatory behavior. The Biden administration's efforts to counter China's economic coercion with trade diversification, supply chains, impact mitigation, these are all good things. There's no denying that these are all good things. But these measures ultimately are reactive and defensive in nature. They protect some supply chains from disruption, but they do nothing to deter the overall practice of economic coercion. Garnering the political will among countries to support a collective economic deterrence strategy is not easy. Free riding is likely. Smaller states would be worried that China would try to pick them off as the weakest link, and companies might not be willing to participate. Rather than pulling together a random group of states targeted by Chinese bullying, collective resilience could be advocated by, for example, G7 countries plus Australia. These are like-minded partners that believe in supporting the liberal international order. They are medium to large players that might not be easily picked off by China. They already participate in anti-coercion efforts of the European Union, or in Australia's case, have stood up to Chinese bullying, and they have the capabilities to leverage China's vulnerability. G7 plus Australia countries have almost 400 items upon which China is 70% dependent, with a trade value of over $37 billion, 2022 trade value, and almost 160 items valued at $7.5 billion, upon which China is 90% dependent. Again, these like-minded countries could use the threat of multilateral action in the trade space to impose significant and unacceptable costs on China if China were to try to coerce others economically. Collective resilience focuses not on the use of economic punishment. It is not advocating a trade war. It is the credible threat of a collective of states to carry out the punishment unison if China acts against any one of the states. Globalists might find this strategy anathema to the very liberal order that they are trying to protect, but we have to treat this as a pure competition strategy necessary to save that order. Hopefully, the threat of collective resilience would never have to be used. In that sense, it is like deterrence in the security realm. It requires both capabilities and political will of all involved to signal to China that it can no longer use economic coercion as a tool of diplomacy to threaten the liberal international order. Thank you, sir, very much.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Our second witness is Dr. Jamil Jaffer. Mr. Jaffer is the founder and executive director of the National Security Institute and is assistant professor of law and director of the National Security Law and Policy Program at Anton Scalia Law School. Mr. Jaffer, welcome to the Rules Committee, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, Government Governor, and members of the committee, thanks for inviting me to discuss the coercive economic tactics employed by China against the United States, our allies, and our industry, and the impact that these tactics have on our economic and our national security. As this committee knows, China today continues, as it has for many years, to engage in an unambiguous type of economic warfare. This economic warfare takes a variety of forms. It involves large-scale intellectual property theft, the scale and scope of which is so vast as to have been referred to as the greatest transfer of wealth in modern human history. China also seeks to pressure American companies, holding them hostage, as they do with our overseas allies and partners as well, when they enter, remain in, or expand in the domestic Chinese market. They threaten the economic viability of these same organizations when they or their host nations or even individuals have the temerity to speak out against China's domestic and global repression of its own people and of our allies and partners around the globe. Or when our allies and partners adopt policies aimed at responding to the widespread economic predation that China engages in. What's critical to note about these aspects of China's economic warfare is that they are all aimed directly and squarely at undermining our national security. The core goal of these tactics is not simply to gain economic benefit for China. The core goal is to interfere with and shape our decision-making and the decision-making of our allies at a national level. As such, it has at its core an effort to undermine our own leadership around the globe and our role in the international community. They use a variety of methods to do this. They go after places where we and our allies agree, seeking to divide and conquer against us. They go after the exports of our allies that are being exported to China, as Dr. Cha just laid out. This represents a long-standing pattern of Chinese behavior. This isn't the first time in recent years that we've seen this. We've seen it over a decade plus. Just last month, we saw China lash out at Micron, a US-based chip maker, subjecting it to a cybersecurity review in response not to Micron's own activities, but to US government activity to respond to China's efforts to build advanced semiconductors, the cutting off, rightly, of American-made technology and Allied-made tooling. These direct actions against American good and allied goods and services are just one example of Chinese government extortion. They make demands of US allied companies that are looking to access their market, requiring them to enter into joint ventures or transfer intellectual property. We also see China use massive government subsidies, low-interest loan programs, and support for loss-leading industrial efforts in order to gain unfair market share for its national champions. What's clear from these examples is that China isn't interested in just economic power. It's a concerted effort to gain a strategic advantage for their nation, leverage for itself, and undermine our ability and that of our allies to obtain similar opportunities and to fundamentally obtain those policy changes that I mentioned earlier. At the end of the day, those policy changes are focused on China's core national interests, which are often contrary to ours and therefore undermine our national security. We see China making inroads not just in the Indo-Pacific region, but in Latin America as well, and in new places where we've long had the primary role, the Middle East. You see the access that China is gaining today to telecoms infrastructure, cloud computing infrastructure, the power grid, the ports of our allies in Latin America, and it makes you contemplate what kind of leverage they can exert within our own hemisphere. Now, in my prepared remarks that I had submitted to the committee, I didn't go into a lot of detail about what we might do about it, and so I want to go into a little more detail here and submit my updated statement for the record. As we look at the threat that we face as a nation, it's not just economic coercion for economic's sake, but it's economic coercion targeted at our governments and our private sector companies. As Dr. Chan mentioned, the European Union has made efforts to obtain this anti-coercion instrument. They've gotten agreement between the European Commission and the European Council. We need to undertake a serious effort, whether that's through HR 1135 or other legislative vehicles, to provide the same kind of authorities to respond effectively to Chinese economic coercion as a government. But it's not just what we do. It's also about what our allies do. And we need to avoid things that undermine our ability to compete against China. Our allies today, take the example of Europe. They today are implementing laws like the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, the EU Cloud Services Schemes, all efforts aimed not at confronting China as the major threat to their economy, but at confronting American companies, American technological innovation, undermining our ability to compete not just in Europe, but around the globe. At home, we have similar concerns. In a bipartisan way, there are concerns about big technology companies. And yet those concerns turn into legislation, antitrust efforts and the like, that undermine our ability at scale to compete against a nation that subsidizes its own industry like China. We must avoid these types of efforts and instead focus on incentivizing our own industry to do more to support our economy, establish resilient supply chains, and support our allies when they're faced with economic predation from China. A variety of ways we can do that. The Export-Import Bank has a program called the China and Transformational Exports Program, which noticeably reserves about 20% of Ex-Im's financing authority to support American exports in 10 critical areas. We also need to ensure that neither we in the United States nor our allies undercut one another when these activities take place. The ranking member mentioned the need for a multilateral export control regime. There's no doubt that we need to work together with our allies to achieve that, but we also have to ensure that our allies can't get around the regime when it's economically convenient to do so. That's a hard thing to do and one we must confront. And then, of course, one of the biggest challenges that you as members of this committee and of Congress face is the real question about what to do about American outbound investment in China. The executive branch is making moves in this area already. We know that the Biden administration is going to issue an executive order in the near future on outbound investment. Congress can and should play a central role in ensuring we put the right guardrails in place and that any action taken by the U.S. government doesn't inadvertently have the effect of limiting our competitiveness while other nations undermine the effectiveness of our export controls and investment restrictions. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to present my views today. I look forward to hearing your questions and answering them.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Our third witness is Dr. Derek Scissors. Dr. Scissors is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Dr. Scissors, welcome to the Rules Committee, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'm going to take the opportunity of the introduction of outbound investment to say I put out a paper this morning giving numbers on outbound investment that are a little more accurate than the ones the Treasury Department publishes every month, wherein it says that the leading recipient of U.S. outbound portfolio investment is the Cayman Islands, which does not have any portfolio investment markets to invest in. So if you're interested in that topic, please check the paper from AEI this morning. On the actual topic of the hearing that I was supposed to talk about, I'm going to be more focused, I think, than my colleagues on the panel have been to this point. In my more focused remarks, I will draw one conclusion, which is to now, China has been quite cost-sensitive in its economic coercion. That is, it wants to impose costs on others, but it does not want to accept costs for itself. You can imagine a different strategy where you are willing to accept costs for yourself because it's so serious, you want to show how serious you are. That has not been the Chinese pattern to this point. That opens the door to the possibility, not the guarantee, but the possibility that we can push them away from a number of acts of economic coercion by threatening to raise their costs. And the way to do that is to make a U.S. response credible. And I think the reason we're having this hearing, I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, is because you all have recognized that a bipartisan legislation is what makes U.S. response credible. Without any prejudice to any administration, executive orders are transient, and they are necessarily not bipartisan. That's not what brings credibility. What brings credibility is bipartisan legislation on the topic. That, in my opinion, has a chance of deterring a great deal of Chinese economic coercion. There's no guarantee, but to this point, they have not wanted to pay any price. We can make it clear to them that they will pay a price. My colleagues on the panel have already made this point. I'm going to skip over it pretty much. Most Chinese coercion is actually of foreign firms trying to gain or expand access to the Chinese market. And one example of that is in play right now is the new anti-espionage law, which is being used as a form of data control. And I had the good fun of telling an American consumer products company, which is very positive about China, that will you be as positive when you're not allowed to report your actual results from your Chinese entity, because those are protected. And you will then be in violation of your fiduciary responsibility to your shareholders. So there's some danger, additional danger, on top of past Chinese coercion of foreign firms. But my written testimony and my remarks from this point will be about Chinese coercion of countries, not coercion of companies. Not to say coercion of companies isn't very important, but you don't want me talking for 2 hours, so I will stick to countries. I briefly discussed in the written testimony the coercion of U.S. defense treaty allies in Taiwan. China also coerces, of course, companies that are not U.S. defense treaty allies. But the important part of that is they will coerce our best friends. They will coerce Canada, they will coerce Japan, they will coerce the closest friends the United States have. They frequently involve, in a way that I know is sensitive to the Congress and in American politics generally, their coercion frequently involves agriculture, which raises the opportunity of, well, they're blocking our friends' agricultural shipments. Maybe we should take their place. There's an agricultural market opportunity in China now because they've cut off agriculture from a U.S. ally. We shouldn't do that, right? Right off the bat. That defeats the purpose of what we're trying to accomplish. It's very tempting. Our American farmers didn't do anything wrong. There's a new market opportunity. It's sizable. Why not take it? We're going to have to make a sacrifice if we want our friends to cooperate with us in other areas, and a sacrifice that some people will not want to make. They don't tend to coerce the United States. They will respond to American actions, but they understand that we're the bigger kid on the block. Everybody else is smaller. The EU is bigger, but the EU can't make a decision in less than 5 years. So the Chinese don't really see them as being a peer. They don't start fights with us, which means when you're talking about coercing countries, other countries need our help more than we need everyone else's help. They will sanction us, but only in response to our sanctions. Coercion is usually exactly about what China says it's about, which is weird because they often don't tell the truth about things. But in coercive cases, they usually say, what you've done is outrageous to us. Their coercion doesn't give them what they want. It's rare that a country will just reverse direction. But the Chinese aren't necessarily looking for the country to just say, okay, never mind, we're not doing that anymore, we give in. They're looking to scare everybody else. Don't behave this way. You see what they did? Lithuania set up a Taiwan office with the wrong name. That's literally the crime here. It had the wrong name. We cut off all their exports. You better not do that. They weren't expecting Lithuania to cave. That would be nice. Not what they were expecting. They were telling everyone else, don't act like Lithuania. And that's how they judge success. And in those cases, in that sense, they have been successful. And finally, just to reinforce this point, China's sanctions on our friends, which are some large economies, Japan included, have never yet hurt it economically. And it's because China can invoke sanctions that cost $10 billion. And Chinese GDP last year was $18 trillion, and Chinese wealth last year, in 2021, which is last year, we have measured as about $85 trillion. $10 billion just doesn't matter that much, but it can matter to a smaller country. That's their advantage in this. It's not gonna hurt us, it's gonna hurt you. That's the best kind of coercion you can have. Switching to the American response, we have a credibility problem, and I've already laid it out, which is it's mostly our allies who get hit, our friends, and not us. So we're not defending our own interest. China would believe that we would defend our own interest, but they might not believe we defend our friends' and allies' interests. We might even take advantage of their problem. we need a law that says we're going to fully consider helping targets of Chinese economic coercion. Not committing us, we do it every time, doesn't matter what the situation is, we don't want that. We want some flexibility, but we will consider it, and we will do it quickly. This is a hard thing to ask of a government as big as the United States, but it's not really good if you say, hey, you guys are suffering now, but can you hold on for a couple years and we're gonna get around to responding to your situation? The Congress has many important things on its plate, but in this case, we have to act quickly. We don't have to implement our actions quickly, but we have to tell our friends and allies, we are going to help you quickly. So that's part of the law too. It has to be quick. Again, not committing us in advance, but enabling quick action. Action would have two components. The chairman has already mentioned one. Actually, he's mentioned both, but I'll focus on one. Liberalization to help China's target, which is illustrated in HR 1135. That's what we want to do to take away the pain. You can't sell to China. They're not sending tourists to your country. We're going to make it easier for you to do that with us. On a temporary basis, maybe, but nonetheless, you don't have to knuckle under, and the signal is sent that nobody has to knuckle under. And on the deterrent side, on the punishment side of Chinese coercion, or the threat of that punishment to deter them, we have lots and lots of options. We have goods options, which we have used, tariffs. We have restrictions on investment, which my colleague on the panel has mentioned. We have controls on technology transfer. We have controls on people-to-people movements. I don't think it should be business as usual if China is coercing an American ally. I think there should be some response that says, no, we don't need to talk to you right now. The Chinese certainly use, we're not going to talk to you because we're mad at you, as an attempt to influence us. That should be in our playbook as well. The hardest issue here is who should we help and how strongly should we help them? It's easy for me to sit up and say, we should help everybody and we should, okay, that's not the way the real world works. The way the real world works is obviously our closer friends matter more. It's the way it is. It's also the case that countries that cooperate with us more on China matter more, and that doesn't always fit with our closest friends. I'm going to pick on Germany. I could pick on other countries too. I didn't discuss the pork embargo that Dr. Cha brought up from Germany because I kind of think the Germans deserve what they get on China economic relations. At least some German companies deserve what they get. And I've told them that in private as well. I'm not talking behind their back. We have some of our close friends who are very good friends of the United States for a long time and are good friends to us on a lot of issues, who on China seem to think with a one-track mind. Oh, we'll protest, but ultimately we want to sell. So we'll keep ourselves quiet. We have to consider that in our responses as well. If a country doesn't want to cooperate with us on our China initiatives, we shouldn't be rushing to their defense. Those are difficult calls to make. Some flexibility has to be built into the legislation, but the legislation being bipartisan, being in place so that China and our friends know that it's there, and being flexible and nimble would be very valuable. Two closing remarks, one I was going to make and one which the ranking member prompted me to make. One is, I don't think this is an important issue in terms of changing the American economy. I think we can respond to Chinese economic coercion without major economic costs, which means that, this is something that's interesting to do. It's not gonna cost us that much. The scale isn't that large. The exception to that is economic coercion that can take place in a Taiwan standoff. And it may be that in legislation, we have to treat Taiwan separately, because Taiwan is an area where I think US-China escalation could be quite considerable. And I don't mean to say we should just give in. That is not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying that elsewhere, I don't think this is a major economic issue for the United States. It's a foreign policy issue. We should support our friends. We should stand up for the right thing. It's not gonna cost us a lot of money. There's no case of that. The one exception could be a future standoff over Taiwan. And the last thing, just because the ranking member brought this up, and I think it's a really important broad issue, in the CHIPS Act, it would be really helpful for US credibility on Chinese economic coercion in general if the CHIPS Act were about, and this isn't pointing a finger at anyone, it's an illustration, we're about the full supply chain. If you support by legislation or by executive action, production in the United States, and the production, say, uses Chinese silicon and Chinese packaging services at the front and back end of the production process, you're not making America more independent. And you are opening the door to more Chinese coercion, and you are creating lobbyists in the United States who will say, don't help our friends because the Chinese might mess with us on chips. So I stayed mostly, I should have stayed entirely in my lane talking about international economic coercion. Connected to that is when we take economic actions here that make us more independent of China, we are better at responding to Chinese economic coercion. If we take the actions thinking about short-term profitability, or there's a big ceremony in my district or my state, and we end up a little more dependent on China, we're going to make the economic coercion problem worse. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Finally, our fourth witness is Yacho Wang. Ms. Wang is the senior China researcher at the Human Rights Watch. Ms. Wang, welcome to the Rules Committee. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Dear Chairman Cole, Ranking Member McGovern, and the members of the committee, first of all, thank you for inviting Human Rights Watch to testify on this issue, because we absolutely believe that human rights should be an important component of this discussion on economic coercion. And we very much appreciate the committee's recognition of this. The reason that the CCP has been able to get away with so many abysmal human rights violations for so long is due in no small part to its mastery in leveraging its economic size for political purposes. The panelists who spoke before me discussed one of the key tactics, which is that the Chinese government conditions foreign companies' access to the China market on compliance with its political demands, which I totally agree. But I also wanted to emphasize that American companies and companies of America's allies have by and large readily obliged, which is why the CCP's economic coercion works. Take the world's largest company, Apple, for example. Since 2017, Apple has removed thousands of apps and VPNs from China's App Store because the Chinese government demand that, which had an effect of making it very difficult for Chinese people to access banned information. Apple's self-censorship is now also affecting what people around the world can watch. One time, Apple's leadership told the creators of shows on Apple TV to not create shows that portray China in a negative light. Apple is just one example. Other big tech companies have similarly succumbed to Chinese government's pressure, creating the creation of a Chinese digital space that netizens are subject to pervasive censorship and surveillance. A study shows that Microsoft's search engine Bing actually censors political sensitive content more than Chinese domestic search engines. The Chinese government has also leveraged market access to force companies to be complicit in one of the world's worst human rights crises, Xinjiang. Chinese authorities have repeatedly encouraged consumers to boycott companies that have publicly expressed concerns for forced labor in Xinjiang. Facing this kind of consumer backlash, some major companies have took down online statements expressing their concerns for the situation in Xinjiang. Intel, the American chipmaker, actually apologized for sending out a letter telling its suppliers to not source from Xinjiang. And there are other companies that have taken a step further. They actually publicly pledged to continue to source from Xinjiang. When we are on the topic of German companies, Volkswagen operates a factory in Xinjiang since 2013, and despite independent research shows that the company is at a high risk of using forced labor, the company says that it's committed to stay in Xinjiang as long as economically feasible. And in March, it says that it will expand its investments in China. If large companies like Apple and Volkswagen are unable or unwilling to resist the Chinese government's pressure to cooperate with its machinery of repression, imagine smaller companies, the kind of concessions they are asked to make and are making in order to do business in China. Companies are massively failing to fulfill their human rights responsibilities in China. So it's crucial for the US government to step in and to force companies to be in compliance with international human rights laws. To that end, Human Rights Watch urges Congress to, among other things, first, hold hearings requesting company executives to testify, to talk about their China operations, including to disclose how they respond to requests from Chinese authorities that would run contrary to their human rights responsibilities. Second, enact legislations that require company operating in the U.S. to conduct human rights due diligence for their operations globally. Third, enact legislation that require great transparency from tech companies, including the apps and the content they remove at the requests of governments. And the U.S. executive branch should, first of all, effectively enforce the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act and other existing legislations that impose financial penalties for companies that import or attempt to import products that are linked to forced labor in China. Last, but very important, and other panelists have also talked about, which is that the U.S. government should hold dialogues with other key markets, such as the EU, the UK, Australia, and Canada, to coordinate their actions in addressing China's economic coercion. My last point is that for the past 40 years, unprincipled economic engagement, which American companies willingly participated, have made China not only the world's second largest economy, but also gave the Chinese government the power and the leverage to expand and deepen human rights violations. So Beijing's repression is increasingly being felt by people around the world now. And I think it's more urgent than ever that the US government take actions to address this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've got specific questions for each of you, but I want to begin with a more general question and invite any of you that care to respond to do it. As an old historian, I tend to think historically. And I'm curious if we've ever faced a comparable or similar type situation in our history with another nation. If so, how did we respond, and what lessons would you draw that would be applicable or helpful in informing what our congressional response would be now?
I mean, I talk too much, so I'll answer, but I claim no special
I was going to direct it at you anyway. So.
Okay. I claim no special expertise in history. So the beginning of American economic history, of course, we are not the big player on the block, and in particular, the British are. And we responded to various kinds of British pressure by running faster. We built ourselves up. We made ourselves stronger and more independent. That seems to be inapplicable. It actually isn't. Chinese influence over American supply chains especially has some counterparts to dependence on British capital and some finished British goods that we had in our past. I don't mean that my answer to your question, Mr. Chairman, or my initial remarks to say the U.S. should go it alone. That is not a good idea. I mean to say that when you have a possible peer competitor economically, or in the British case, really a superior competitor economically, you do have to strengthen yourselves, and you strengthen yourselves without relying on them. When we have talked about sort of more peers, when the U.S. was more an international economy, or becoming more of an international economy, we took pretty strident action against Japan. So Japan was a peer economy in Asia. They were a rapidly growing industrial economy in the 1930s and 1940s, very impressive, early 1940s, very impressive modernization, in some ways similar to what China has done. And we used economic tools against them because we were bigger than them and we didn't like what they were doing. So in one case, we're not the big kids and we need to get stronger and make sure we don't depend on Britain. In the next case we are the big kids and we're not going to just go along with your behavior despite your impressive economic accomplishments. I think they're both relevant to the Chinese case. I do not want to say that China is just like 18th century Britain or mid-20th century Japan, but our economic history, in my understanding, shows us in both cases saying we need to get better ourselves, always a good idea, and if we don't have to tolerate your behavior, we're not going to.
I'm going to invite any of the, Dr. Shah?
Thank you, Chairman. The only thing I would add to what Derek said is that I think one of the differences today when we think about economic coercion and peer competition is that, as all of us had said, and as you said in your remarks, it requires a multilateral response. And I don't think we've been in a situation before where our other allies and partners or like-minded partners frame their relationship with China wholly in terms of dependence. They don't use the word interdependence. They use the word dependence. And arguably we certainly didn't see that in the case of U.S. allies in the Soviet Union, obviously, two completely separate economic blocs. But I think that's one element that's different. The other is that in addition to economic dependence, as they frame it, or as that has been internalized in terms of the way these other countries think, particularly in the global South, China has penetrated the global South so deeply, not with economic coercion. They use economic coercion largely against the global North because we're not as vulnerable to them in terms of our media and their disinformation, and we're not as vulnerable in terms of the need for capital like the global South is. So something else that's different is China has a strategy for the global South focused on carrots, BRI, capital finance, and massive disinformation, and arguably that's different from what we have faced in the past.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Jaffer, let me go to you and just ask you, let's assume for a minute that all this effort, and there is a lot of bipartisan effort. My friend, the ranking member, did some really important legislation dealing with the oppression of Chinese Uyghur. We have this select committee, which I really pleased the speaker advanced. I'm really pleased with the reception it got on the Democratic side of the aisle. I think if you look at the members on that committee, both sides of the aisle sent really serious people that I think are determined to work together. So it's kind of a promising beginning. If you had to speculate, and let's assume we continue to build on this, we become a little bit more successful. Again, the CHIPS Act has been mentioned by several of you. So again, there's a response shaping up here. What would you anticipate the Chinese response would be? It's hard to think they would allow a response without some sort of reaction. So trying to play chess instead of checkers, how do you see them responding?
Yeah, no, look, I think we have to be prepared for a robust Chinese response. They are not going to take our pushback sitting down. They, I think, estimate that we don't have the willingness to stick around. We don't have the stomach for the long-term fight, whether that's an economic fight or a military fight. They assess that we are itinerant, that we are divided at home, and that we're unwilling to stand by our allies. And the reason they make that assessment is because it represents a decade and a half of recent U.S. history. We haven't been the strongest ally to our friends. We haven't been the strongest adversary to our enemies. We haven't stood by our statements. We've made broad statements about expectations of friends and neighbors and partners, and we haven't stood by them. We haven't enforced our red lines when they've been put out there. And at every turn, we seem like the last person to engage when our national interests are engaged. Now, this isn't the longer history, this isn't the longer arc of American history. The long arc of American history is exactly the opposite. And so the kind of bipartisanship that you're talking about here on the Hill, that this committee is demonstrating, that the Select Committee has demonstrated, and that we've seen on China issues going forward, to Dr. Sitter's point, is exactly the kind of bipartisanship that will put steel behind our words and demonstrate the kind of resolve that we really have. If we can continue to move the ball down the road and demonstrate that we aren't divided on this issue, and that we do have the willingness to take the fight to the Chinese, whether that's economically or militarily in the case of a Taiwan conflict, or politically when they come and try to undermine our own democracy, right? That's how we win. That's how we demonstrate to them that we are actually here to make it happen. Unfortunately, that hasn't been the rubric. Even where we have bipartisan agreement, we tend to take iterative action. We don't take bold, aggressive action. The Chinese, like the Russians, the Iranians, and the North Koreans, understand and respect power. We haven't operated like a first world nation in the better part of a decade. The sooner we do that, and we do that in a bipartisan way, the more likely the Chinese are to take us seriously.
Thank you very much. You have other questions, but I'm going to hold myself to my own limits, and I want to turn to my good friend, the ranking member, for his opening questions.
Well, thank you all for being here today. And Ms. Wang, your testimony and your recommendations are focused on the role played by businesses and business organizations. Some members of Congress are, to be blunt, are uncomfortable calling out businesses, especially U.S. businesses. Why? It's a two-part question. Why is it important for us to shine a light on business practices, even as we call out the practices of the PRC? And secondly, businesses often resist the transparency measures that you recommend that Congress require. What do you say to them about why they should embrace greater transparency in their dealings with China? And as the chairman mentioned, we worked in a bipartisan way. I'm the author of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, but I will tell you, and I was chairman at the time, so I used to have that office. But I lost count of how many meetings that we had with American businesses and business organizations basically against it, pushing back against it. And even now, I suspect that some of them are trying to get the administration to take a more lax approach. I mean, we're obviously, I think they're wrong, but nonetheless, that's the reality. So maybe.
Thank you for the questions. First, I think we all know that the reason the Chinese government is able to undermine human rights at such a large scale, and not just people in China, but also people around the world, is because of its economic power. That's why it has the power to do those things, to commit those kind of human rights abuses. And the reason that it has such economic power has so much to do with that American companies and companies of American allies engaged with China. So I think the link is quite direct. Why American companies should care about the human rights. Second, how to convince American companies that you should care about human rights in China? I would give you an example of Apple. Apple is now so entrenched in China. Most of the Apple products we use are made, assembled at least in China. And China is Apple's second largest market. And because China has so much leverage over Apple, Apple has, keep basically kowtowing to the Chinese government for whatever its demands. But last year, during the zero COVID policy, one of Apple's biggest supply, Foxconn, had a huge riot by its factory workers because people couldn't deal with this zero COVID policy anymore because it was so draconian and made no sense. And the reason China had this zero COVID policy that was affecting Apple's production so much is because nobody was telling President Xi Jinping, this policy makes no sense because it's not a democratic system. This guy is not getting good information. So that's why, China had the zero COVID policy for 3 years that was having a huge impact on Apple. So you can see the links. And I would also give you an example of, big tech companies, Facebook, who really, Facebook and Microsoft and others, who really tried to stay in China by, by agreeing to whatever the Chinese government wants. Being, as I mentioned in the testimony, that has, by some measures, censors more than Chinese domestic search engines. But last year, LinkedIn, which also owned by Microsoft, has withdrawn from the Chinese market for whatever reasons we don't understand. But the point is that because the country has no rule of law, has no transparency, so even the American companies wanted to ingratiate itself with the Chinese government. Ultimately, they couldn't deal with the kind of opacity to the point that they have to quit. Right. So this is all linked together.
I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on it. I mean, I guess the point is that it's always struck me as a little bit more than frustrating that the human rights arguments oftentimes get detached from the business arguments. I mean, in many respects, those companies that went along just to get along, are finding themselves in a, it doesn't work, right? I mean, it doesn't work. But I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on that. Yeah, Mr. Jaffer? Yeah.
So, I just want to highlight one particular example, and we're all familiar with it, and it's the case of the NBA, right? We talk about 1 million Muslim Uyghurs being interned in modern-day gulags, and the fact that a player or two, some senior officials in one organization had the temerity to speak out about this outrageous human rights behavior led to the NBA cowering, going after its own players, its own coaches, its own owners for this type of activity, and ultimately kowtowing to the Chinese Communist Party is appalling. I mean, the NBA should be ashamed of its behavior. It should be punished, not by the U.S. government, by its American fan base. You have American parents who buy their kids DJI drones for Christmas, right? You think about it, DJI drones are actually used to enforce some of these very forced labor practices, the activities that take place in these forced labor camps. I mean, we need a national understanding that what the Chinese Communist Party is doing to its own people and its export of this repressive activity globally is not something that any American company should stand for, and we should call them out for it, and they should be punished economically by their own purchasers and families. We've got to put a stop to this. That turns on each one of us when we buy presents for our kids at Christmas, and we buy tickets for the NBA.
Dr. Chair?
So the only thing I'd add to that in the NBA case is we actually collected the data that showed how many of these star NBA players actually had shoe deals in China as well. So that was certainly something that affected the way they thought about it. On the companies, just 2 quick points. The first is, in addition to desire for the market, if they are the target of economic coercion, they want the problem to go away as soon as possible. So they're not interested in anything but getting rid of the coercion as quickly as possible. In some cases, they won't even report it because they don't want to draw attention, and they try to absolve themselves of the problem as quickly as possible. The longer-term effect of that, as you know very well, sir, is that it leads to a culture of self-censorship among all these companies, which is, to me, as much of a threat to the United States and the liberal international order as a military crisis in the Taiwan Straits. I think by 2027, personal view, I think there's a less than 50% chance that that China will attack Taiwan, but there is a 100% chance they will use economic coercion against companies and against other countries.
Dr. Sousa, before I go to you, I just want to point out one thing. We did a hearing in the China Commission. This is with the major companies that sponsored the Olympics. And we couldn't even get them to say that they're concerned about the human rights situation in China, which just struck me as, outrageous, number one, but the idea that that these companies, that, by the way, China benefits from them as well. I mean, they have companies in China, that employ Chinese workers. I mean, China benefits from the presence of international companies, U.S. companies in particular. But the idea that you can't even say, because you're afraid that somehow it might negatively impact your business, that we are concerned about the human. I didn't even get to the question of, do you believe that, the Uyghurs are being oppressed in Xinjiang? I mean, just that there's a concern. And I think, we need the business community to understand that it is in their long-term interest, to work with us on this. I mean, Dr. Scissors?
This is going to sound overly dramatic, but I think we're raising examples here of China undermining America as an open society, and I'll make it specific to business. You cannot say you're in favor of America's global economic engagement and free trade and all the things companies say when you're opposed to transparency, right? That's open markets rely on transparency. So when companies say, I can't believe you would restrict our engagement with China, but I don't want to tell you what that engagement with China is, they're just saying, I don't care about principles or the national interest. I only care about short-term profits. So one to me, wedge for Congress is, if you are a properly functioning business, you're required in the United States to disclose your revenue, disclose your business situation if you're publicly listed and so on. That's protecting the rule of law. If you tell us China is really important to our operations, don't hurt them. But we're not going to tell you exactly what's going on there. Right? You're not functioning properly as an American business. And I'm not talking about sanctioning anyone. I'm not cutting anyone off. I would say on the business side, some American businesses have gone so far that they have lost their way in terms of why they are able to make money, what they're supposed to be doing. And I'm not talking about ESR. I'm talking about being transparent with people you're doing business with. So that to me is an area where Congress can impose requirements, not taxing them, not fining them, just saying this is part of your job as a business. It would help our China policymaking, and it would force them against their will to think, I don't know if the transparency on China is worth the money we make off China.
Yeah, and we, as the chairman said, we try to stick to the 5-minute rule here. We don't ever do that here. I mean, we have people.
It's very unnatural.
For like 9 hours of questions, right? But I will respect that. I just want to kind of close with this, and I'm not saying this is not meant to be partisan at all, but this is a very polarized Congress that we have, but I do think that there is more unity than not on this topic, and I think the danger sometimes that we confront is sometimes we get into this, who can out-demagogue the other person, and then you get into moving beyond like the actual facts and reality of a situation, and then we get into a whole different element where sometimes it's we're into conspiracy theories, and I think the bottom line is, that we have done some good stuff on China, not only with regard to the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, but even some legislation on human rights in Tibet, where we've had enormous bipartisan support. And so I think the point that you have all taken is really important. That is that our strength is in our unity here. If we are divided, if we get into these like who can outdo this person, and we start adding things to China legislation that makes people uncomfortable because people don't know whether it's true or not, we end up in a situation where we show division. So I think the unity is our strength here. But I appreciate all of your testimony, and I will, respecting the 5-minute rule, yield back to the chairman.
Well, and just for the edification of our witnesses, I'm sure the ranking member would agree, demagoguery never happens on the Rules Committee. That happens in other parts of Congress, perhaps, but never here. With that, I'll go to our distinguished ranking member, my good friend, Dr. Burgess, our ranking member, Vice Chairman.
Close enough. So, Mr. McGovern, I think, was trying to tee me up when he said demagoguery and tossed it to me. So
I wasn't. I love you.
In that respectful vein, and I don't mean to be too provocative here, but China as an adversary, is it? Well, it's really not China. It's the People's Republic of China. It's the government of China. I think we should be clear on that. It's not the people of China. But, I mean, coercion works, right? We saw that at Tiananmen Square. Tanks work, coercion works. So it's always worked for them in the past. Why would they not pursue a path that has previously been successful and yielded what they desired? Do we have such a track record with collective resistance? Does collective resistance work? And yeah, Dr. Chaw, maybe you could give us an example of that.
Sure. Well, it certainly has worked in the security vein, in the sense that whether it was during the Cold War or whether it was with regard to security in East Asia, a collection of countries that have come together to deal with a security threat by saying very clearly there are major costs that you will, the adversary, the target, that you will incur if you cross this line. This has worked. I mean, we know that it has worked. Arguably, it's much harder on economic issues for all the reasons we've discussed, having to do with companies, and we can't control necessarily what companies can do. But I would simply submit that all the things that we're doing now are good. Trade diversification, impact mitigation, these are all good.
Let me just challenge that notion. I mean, I also serve on the Committee of Energy and Commerce. I've been there for 20 years. During that 20 years, we've seen a sort of low-level, indolent aggression against the United States. And I could go through the litany for you. There was melamine in pet food and baby food. They poisoned our pets in 2006. Heparin was contaminated. China was the source of that contamination. Hypersulfated chondroitin sulfate was a molecule that was patented in China and then used to contaminate the heparin supplies that were sold to this country. And then when the heparin was administered in dialysis units, the patients all died, 100% fatality. I mean, that's pretty aggressive, I think. We never held them to account for any of that. We had a balloon incident, as you may recall. It was in all the papers. Not much pushback from that. So this, oh, and I forget the TikTok hearing that we had in our committee. TikTok is being promoted, is a Chinese company, ByteDance, promoting a product in this country that undermines our youth. And the same product in China, you know, the analogy that was given on public radio was they sell cotton candy in the United States and spinach in China. The TikTok product that's available for Chinese youngsters is going to give them a greater understanding of the world around them, a better way to critically think. And the TikTok that's made available to our young people is again, just purely fluff and in some cases actually dangerous. So I just push back on the notion that, I mean, some of these things are not just low-level aggression. I think they're overt aggression. We never seem to package that up and say, look, this all has to stop. Now, there was one point, probably in January of 2020, with the tariffs that were proposed and the understanding that was reached temporarily between Xi Jinping and President Trump, but then COVID blew it all up and we never got to see that through to fruition. But it's been frustrating to me to watch this, what China or the People's Republic, what Xi Jinping has been doing to this country, and we've not responded.
Well, I entirely agree with you there, sir. And the only thing I would add to that is that that's why this strategy that we propose, collective resilience, goes beyond what we've done so far by actually punishing and imposing costs on China for what they've been doing. So, and I entirely agree with you that packaging up all the things that China has done should help to broaden the coalition of countries that would be part of this strategy.
So other than my brilliant recitation this afternoon, have you ever heard anyone package them together like that? Okay, there you go. I'll patent it. And Dr. Scissors, you looked like you wanted to say something, or maybe I just upset you.
Almost always look like I want to say something. I'm going to say something really negative and then something positive because we should end on a constructive note. The heparin and melamine tragedies were terrible. I would point out that they are dwarfed by a virus that originated in China, probably due to incompetence. I don't think it was intentional, that they still lie about today, that has killed 1.1 million Americans, and we didn't do anything. That's the really negative remark. The positive remark is actually a praising of Congress. We had similar to this situation, although narrower, there was a consensus in Congress. This bill passed 400 to 2 in the House over tighter restrictions on Chinese investment in the United States, where we said, we don't want to stop Chinese investment in the United States, but it's gotten really wild, which it did in 2016. We want to know what's going on. We want to have the regulator have more resources to watch it, and we want to make sure it doesn't involve personal data, and we don't want property bought that is near a sensitive facility, which needs to apparently be fixed. That had overwhelming congressional support. Not only did it work, in my view, it wasn't perfect. Of course it wasn't perfect, but it worked. It inspired our allies to pick up their own reviews of inbound Chinese investment, including Europe. Even though Europe is incredibly slow, their member states have moved and the EU has moved. So we have an example of the Congress led on this, not the administration. The Congress led on this. It passed in an overwhelming bipartisan fashion. It was 85 to 10 in the Senate. And our allies said, Americans are committed to this, and it's a good idea. And we're going to be more thoughtful about it, not that they're perfect. So there is an example. It is not a comprehensive example. It doesn't prove we can do it all the time, everywhere. I don't mean to be too optimistic, but we have seen congressional leadership lead to changes in global behavior. So I think it is possible we can do it again.
I think that's so intelligent. The inbound investment in South America and Central America that we're seeing is perhaps a little more insidious in North America, but it's happening, and we do need to keep it under pretty close surveillance. And I would be stronger on your point on the biologic weapon that was released upon the United States. And then, of course, we've got an ongoing chemical weapon attack in the form of fentanyl and its analogs. So, I mean, really, you package that all together, and it's a pretty hideous record of aggression against the people of the United States, which, after all, we are supposed to represent. Yes, I'm sorry, Ms. Lynn.
May I add a point about TikTok? And I do agree that the ByteDance is making American teenagers addicted to stupid things. But I kind of disagree with the analogy that the Chinese ByteDance is feeding Chinese teenagers spinach, because I think I'm from China. The government didn't feed us spinach, it feeds us propaganda. It's bad, terrible for critical thinking. And I think Americans shouldn't forget the advantages of the society. We have freedom to speak and think what we want, and it's absolutely advantage that America has over China.
Excellent point. I'll observe the 5-minute rule.
Can I just say a critique of TikTok? It's made my daughter like country music. And so I don't know what to say about that. Yeah.
Freedom as expressed by Ms. Wang. So there you have it.
That's
Important.
That's good to know freedom's alive and well in Massachusetts. That's wonderful. My good friend from New Mexico, Ms. Ledger Fernandez, recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for, this is a really wonderful hearing to have versus our earlier hearing this morning, which didn't have the unanimity. But one of the things I wanted to explore a bit was really the impact of China's coercion, China's policies in the Indo-Pacific region, but not forgetting that in the Indo-Pacific region, we also have interests, right? Because the United States exists in the Indo-Pacific region. And I sit as the ranking member on the subcommittee on Indian and Insular Affairs. And so I wanted to get some of your thoughts on the impact that China's coercion is having on that region, and then specifically thinking about what does that mean for our own territories and our own citizens who are living in those regions. Maybe we'll start. Mr. Jaffer.
Thank you, Ms. Ledger Fernandez. I think you're exactly right. I think that this, the way that China exerts its influence in the Pacific, and the U.S., as you rightly point out, is a Pacific nation, not just because our own core landmass borders on the Pacific, but we have territories right in the heart of the Indo-PACOM area of responsibility for the Department of Defense. China has been very effective in the region when it comes to economic coercion, whether that economic coercion is directed at our very close allies, Japan, South Korea, Australia. We saw back years ago when South Korea installed the Theater High Altitude Air Defense System, right? They got the leader of South Korea to agree to 3 no's, right? 3 things that nation, one of our close allies in the region, wouldn't do in terms of ballistic missile defense, in terms of cooperation with the United States, in terms of building a trilateral relationship between us and them and Japan. And so you look at the effectiveness. Now, of course, that's been walked back in recent years with the new leadership in South Korea. Chinese see that. They're putting pressure back on. They tried to pressure Australia when Australia pushed back against Huawei and the like, barring a number of exports. But one of the challenges is that we're not consistent to the point that Dr. Cha made, right? We at times have undercut our own allies selling wine into China when the Australian wine imports were restricted, or exports from Australia into China. And so this idea, I think, of collective resilience is really important, and one that we have to practice. But at the end of the day, what this all comes back to is, does China believe that we're going to stand by our own plans economically, our own plans politically? Are we going to stand by our allies, our partners like Taiwan in the lands and the oceans off the coast of China? And the answer is today they don't believe we will. They've seen it over and over again. They've seen it not just in the Indo-PACOM region, but around the world, where the United States says one thing and then practices the other. Even on the issue of Taiwan alone, they've seen the president say, we will be there militarily for Taiwan. Within minutes, White House staff, including the National Security Advisor, a friend of mine, Jake Sullivan, walks it back. And the Chinese are not surprisingly confused. What is the U.S. policy, right?
Let me go to, because normally we don't have any time limits, so we walk into this magic room here where we can go on and on, except for when it's a matter of our jurisdiction. Dr. Cha, do you want to add to some of the discussion, and if there is a different kind of approach that you're thinking about with regards to this issue?
So, no, I don't disagree with that. I mean, I think there are three sort of major security implications of China's economic coercion of our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific. The first is it causes them to hesitate in terms of joining with us in various types of military exercises, missile defense exercises, anti-submarine warfare exercises, a whole series of things, largely because if they're concerned, if it somehow gets interpreted by China as dealing with a Taiwan Straits contingency, that China is going to use some sort of economic lever on them. So that's one. The second is that, and this is particularly the case in some countries in Southeast Asia, they have caused a number of, not allies, but partners in Southeast Asia to really question who started the war in Ukraine. I mean, they have used a combination of massive disinformation and their economic influence and all the elite capture that they've done in Southeast Asian nations to create a narrative that this war was started by the United States and NATO, right? And that's real. And then the third is, this committee, everybody is talking much more about economic security, building these coalitions, the Chips and Science Act, these sorts of things. China's economic coercion will cause countries to hesitate about should they really be part of this, Netherlands, Japan, South Korea, U.S. coalition. Should they really do that? Because is China then going to come in from behind them and take some sort of action against them? So there are real implications. I know there's a debate in the literature about how much this economic coercion really works. And the reality is it matters a great deal because it affects what countries are willing and not willing to say, self-censorship, and it affects what they're willing and not willing to do. So it's often what they won't say and what they won't do are the real implications of this. They're non-actions that are the real implication of this. And so the work of this committee, this bill, this idea about collective resilience is really trying to say that all of these other partners, we have levers. We have leverage. The United States has leverage that's willing to use, but these countries themselves have leverage in what they trade with China that China needs. But we can only do it if we do it together. If we try to do it one country at a time, we will never succeed.
Right. And I think the issue of collective resilience applies across the board in so many different ways. And when we realize that we never really operate independently or individually, we don't really pull ourselves up by the bootstraps. We actually work collectively. In fact, there's lots of science about how that's how we evolved, Homo sapiens, to sort of we don't have any, we wiped out everybody else because of our unique ability to work cooperatively and collectively. I wanted to go to Dr. Sessions and Ms. Wang a bit about the concept of the disclosure, because you just pointed out how important it would be to have disclosures, right, for businesses. Ms. Wang, in her testimony, pointed out that a recommendation that those disclosures should also include issues around human rights. I'm sorry, Dr. Scissors, right? Can you maybe add to how you, when you were listening to the concept of disclosures are important, because then they will have to say it and we will be able to read it. How do you see that consistent with the recommendations you made to us with regards to disclosures that included human rights issues?
Microsoft, so on and so forth. I think, whether ban or not has so many implications. And so let's go to the first step first, be transparent and telling the world. What's going on with your engagement with the Chinese government? What's your communication? So we can make decisions for the next step based on, the information you disclose.
Thank you, and is that consistent? I think that's consistent with what you shared with us, Dr. Scissors.
Yes, I mean, she was talking about a Chinese subsidiary operating in the U.S., and we could talk about Chinese firms listed on American stock exchanges, which has been an issue, where they will never disclose properly because we have our rules, which we have not enforced, and the rule in China is now if you disclose something that we retroactively call a state secret, you could be executed. Your firm can be easily wound up. We will never be able to match that, and we shouldn't try, which means we're automatically going to get less disclosure from Chinese companies operating here. And that's a policy decision we have to take on, how much less is acceptable. I was thinking more in my response to the previous question about the transparency of American companies. And that transparency is going to be increasingly difficult for them because the Chinese are saying lots of data in China now counts as espionage. And I mean, in my own work, I can just say this very quickly, statistical yearbooks from some provinces are now protected. Like it's just a summary, you lied in the yearbook. Now we can't even see your lies. That's how sensitive the situation is right now. We don't know where they're gonna settle out. So on the one hand, transparency is crucial to the functioning of our economy. It's crucial to the functioning of our political system. And the Chinese are trying to become even less transparent than they were. We can either think of it as telling American companies, you have to do this whether you like it or not, right? We have to know what you're doing in China. Or we can think of it as protecting them because they're going to be increasingly coerced to become less transparent. So I was more thinking about American company disclosures that you cannot say, we're not going to do this anymore where, if you're a huge investor in China, we're going to protect your name and the investment data. We're just going to say that it was you. Okay. And we're going to put that number out there.
Thank you. I think I will yield back. I do believe it is also important, and thank you for raising the Chips and Science Act and the need to how do we actually address the semiconductor need. New Mexico actually is home to Intel, and so I have both an interest for the benefit of my state, but I will yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I now recognize my good friend from Minnesota, Ms. Fishbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for being here. Fascinating stuff, and something that I actually talk about quite a bit when I'm on the campaign, visiting constituents on the campaign trail, whatever you call it. But we talk a lot with constituents about. And I'm from a heavy ag district, so you're going to get kind of that focus. But 1/3 of what my constituents grow is exported, and China's in the top 5 of that. So. And our farmers see that great opportunity for export. They're making their money, But then we talked a little bit. I think someone talked a little bit about the actions of China being a little coercive, and when there's that much of our ag products going there, they're able to control that much, and so use those practices to exert kind of influence on us. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. And I'm kind of throwing a lot of things out. And it's one of those points where I just want you to discuss it, kind of if you understand where I'm going. And, now China has made ag equipment one of their pillars in their Made in China 2025, is it? And that concerns me because of national security issues. Are we going to be able to get it? And their control. They're also buying a lot of land across the country. And I think North Dakota is the one that stopped them from buying it close to, and even though I'm real close to North Dakota, we don't pay as much attention to them as, but I do know that they are trying to control that. It really, what I'm very concerned about is, and I think you were getting at it a little bit, Doctor, that the issue of the economic interest, and that's a great driver for my farmers. I mean, a great driver for all of us, and then how do you balance that with national security? Because everybody's concerned about that. So I guess that's kind of what I'm getting at is how do we do that? And what kinds of things make sense in able to control that? Because I see China as a real threat.
So, when I meet with an American company, whether it's agriculture or not, that has a heavy dependence on China, I did this earlier today, yesterday, it happens all the time. I say, my telling you should make less money off China is probably not going to convince you. I'm guessing that I'm not worth $1 billion in lost sales. But you better be prepared for a bad outcome. You better be prepared for them targeting you in coercion, and I'll tell you some things about how likely that is and under what circumstances and how bad it will be. You also better be prepared for U.S.-China economic relations to blow up, for example, over Taiwan, that being the most. And that doesn't require an assault on Taiwan. It could be less than that. It could be less of a military confrontation with a huge economic component. So I have spoken repeatedly to soybean farmers and said, there is no substitute for China. For your demand, there isn't. There are other goods that you can substitute for China to some extent, not for soybeans. So I can't tell you stop selling soybeans to China, and I wouldn't tell you to stop lobbying. It's a free country. But do you have a plan when your soybean exports to China get cut in half or worse? Some you'll be able to reroute through the Brazilians and the Argentinians, but some of it will just stop. They don't want to be dependent on the U.S. for soybeans. They're going to try to reduce that dependence. Are you trying to reduce your dependence on China? So the answer is not that you go cold turkey on the Chinese market, that you cut yourself off. But you better have a plan, and the plan's going to involve some pain. The plan is not, we have a bad month. The plan is we have a bad 3 years. What are you going to do? So that's how I would balance them. That's a very general point. I could make it more specific if you said, talk to me about exactly which farmers in Minnesota. I was just looking at the farm trade data yesterday. But the general point is, if you're not willing to give up the market, it has a lot of drawbacks, as my colleagues on the panel have pointed out. But if you feel like you can't give up the market, there's too much involved, you still need a plan for when things go south. It could go south because the Chinese initiate it. It could go south because the United States feels like it has to defend vital interests. And then there won't be an argument anymore about how important China is. They just won't be buying your stuff. What are you going to do?
And you know what? I know that there's some that can go through Brazil, through South America, whatever the case is, but what do they do? I mean, they have a huge, what does China do? Because they have a huge need for soybeans.
Well, it is a lot easier, as you appreciate much more than I do, to tell Chinese citizens too bad than it is to tell American citizens too bad. The Chinese, we are the richer, bigger, more powerful, and now more dynamic economy. Every economic clash ultimately favors us. What the Chinese believe is we won't put up with it. If drugs disappear from American shelves, that's going to cause us to collapse in a confrontation with China faster than the hardships that are imposed on the Chinese. And I hate to put it this way, but as my colleague said, 3 years of irrational zero COVID, and there was unhappiness, but they tolerated it. We would never be able to tolerate 3 years like that in this country unless we were at war. So their advantage is purely the party thinks that they will put up with more hardship than we will. It's not leverage. If we took American economic leverage and Chinese economic leverage, ours would be bigger. But do we have the political will to suffer the cost they can impose on us when they have the political will to suffer the cost we can impose on them?
And I see that but I just wanted to respond to that. So, and maybe this is for everybody. What kind of plan are you? I mean, are you talking, a diversification? We talked about diversification of markets. Scaling. Just preparing the American people for having no place to send their crops. This is a big issue for me, and I've already talked too much. So let me just be really quick. We already have companies putting in Taiwan insurance in deals. You have to start paying those insurance costs. You have to say, I need long-term insurance on my revenue, which is going to be expensive, against a big blow. Obviously, with a company that has marginal interest in China, it's too easy for them. That's why I picked soybeans, because I want it to be hard. So you have to prepare for your revenue gets cut in half. You're a soybean exporter to China, and you've lost half your revenue. The rest is redirected. You have to think about other crops. Find other markets if you can. Diversify your business out of agriculture if possible, and get insurance. None of it is a great outcome. There's not a one-size-fits-all result. I view the select committee on the political side as communicating to Americans, we have a problem, you need to know more about it. So at the political level, it's telling your constituents, I'm not trying to stop your exports to China, but they may get stopped. What are you ready to do? And then for them, it's either a pretty easy thing or it's an extremely hard thing that involves paying more money now for insurance, starting up new businesses that are going to cost money that won't be as profitable. But if you have I'm making up numbers,
billion-dollar profits for the next 5 years, and then they go to zero for 3 years after that, that's your real profitability. It's not just what you have now. And maybe an alternative business is actually more profitable when you pull in the risk.
Thank you. And Dr.
Say that on the specific question that you asked, the dangers with regard to Chinese economic coercion are not necessarily those places that are able to export a lot to China, and where China is highly dependent on those exports. So to me, it's not that China can use this economic coercion anywhere they want. They will only use it in places where they know they have alternative places to buy the stuff from, or when they have low dependence. So, for example, the recent numbers I looked at for 2022, China was, I think, 85% dependent on corn exports, maize, from the United States as a percentage of their total exports of corn. I don't think they're, and part of that had to do with Ukraine, right? But I don't think they're going to go after that because they need that. Just like they won't go after semiconductors because they need those things. The producers we have to worry about here are the ones where China imports some of the stuff from us, but they have many other alternative markets, and they're not highly dependent on us as a percentage of their total imports of those goods. Those are the ones they will squeeze. Those are the ones they will go after. But they will not go after semiconductors. I mean, in the THAAD example you gave, China went after, South Korean companies, tourism to South Korea, billions of dollars of losses, but they would not touch Samsung Semiconductor. They would not touch them. Same thing with TSMC, right? They will not touch TSMC. So I think the part of the answer to your constituents is they have to sort of map out where they see themselves sitting in the way China makes purchases. And if there are cases where they're a supplier, but they're not a major supplier for China, and China has many alternative markets, those are the producers that really have to watch their back. Those are the ones that are much more likely to become a target of Chinese economic coercion, as opposed to this big hegemon that in Minnesota, where they're doing most of China's imports are coming from Minnesota in whatever the produce will be. China's not going to touch that.
I just want to say one thing in response. I agree with Dr. Cha completely, but I do want to make one point that Dr. Scissors made, which is that while it is true that there are some categories where China is very reliant on the U.S. or U.S. and our allies, they are actively seeking to diversify away from reliance on us and reliance on our allies for all the reasons you've heard today about why we need to diversify away. And so even in those areas where Dr. Cha is right, that today they're relying upon us, your constituents need to know that they're making that effort, and as a result, as Dr. Scissors correctly said, they need to start thinking about how to diversify who they're supplying to as well. And if we need to give them capabilities and incentives to export to other markets or help them create new markets, then we ought to do that as well.
And that is something, I mean, for the farmers, we do need to help them diversify, get into those new markets. But with China, they're spending a lot of time, what's the word I'm looking for, not pandering, but, cozying up to a lot of these countries, spending money there, and really trying to get them to be, attached to them, so they're going to export there. And so I'm concerned that they are, setting themselves up that way to end really as much trade with us. And so I'm concerned about how not only our farmers, I happen to be a heavy ag district, so I am concerned, it's one of my top priorities, but concerned about those things. So, and I see y'all nodding, but Doctor, did you want to say something? Someone turned on their mic or no? Nope, okay. I thought I saw someone flip their mic, but I really appreciate the opportunity just to, hear a little bit about what you guys are thinking, because it's a huge issue that we are going to be facing, sooner rather than later on how we deal with this. So, and with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
And now go to my good friend from New York, Mr. Langworthy.
Thank you so much, Chairman Cole, and thank you to all of the witnesses for your testimony here today. And as you're aware, the Biden administration has made it policy to force Americans into a future comprised of electric vehicles, solar panels, wind turbines, and other trappings of Democrats' Green New Deal visions of America. President Biden's goal specifically calls for a 50% of all new vehicle sales to be electric by 2030, the deployment of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, plus another 15 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2035. moving forward with nearly $5 billion in growing and solar energy investments. And as you know, the U.S. is currently a net importer of all of the key resources needed to power this vision, such as rare earths, cobalt, lithium, manganese, and others. In the case of some, we are completely reliant on foreign sources. Dr. Scissors, to clarify, China is the -- 1 exporter of rare earth minerals, correct? Yes. Thank you.
I should say it's the #1 exporter of refined.
The refined. Very good, thank you. Thank you. And just to be specific, China accounts for 63% of the world's rare earth mining and 85% of rare earth processing and 92% of rare earth magnet production. And meanwhile, here in the United States, we have only one operational rare earth mine, California's Mountain Pass mine, and the extent of our most recent activity under this administration has been to sign an executive order to review the shortcomings of America's domestic supply chains for rare earth, or in other words, just another study, and announce a $30 million research initiative into how best to source domestic rare earths, and we created a fact sheet. So that's a study, some research, and a fact sheet, all to explore and retell a problem that we know exists in a very big way. So I'd like to pivot here a little bit. One of the key metals for EV batteries is cobalt. Dr. Scissors, as you probably know, the world's largest cobalt reserves are located in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. One of the world's largest cobalt mines located in southeastern Congo is Tenke Fungurume, and was bought by a state-owned Chinese mining company. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. It's co-owned by two state-owned Chinese companies, so it seems like there's a partnership, but they're both responsible to the state.
Okay. Could you please elaborate for me how China's domination of cobalt and other rare mineral sources in Congo and elsewhere could create or is already creating a coercive situation for the U.S. as we pursue this battery-powered future charted by this administration?
I can do a little bit of that. I will say there's a quick parallel to be made here that I think we're all familiar with, which is that Europe has been very aggressive on green energy targets, and it sort of took to them like, we don't want to have fossil fuels being produced in Europe anymore. That led them to be dependent on what? Russian natural gas. And so we had this, we're outraged at the invasion of Ukraine, we're opposing sanctions, but oil and gas sanctions need to wait, we need to wait. That was not an ideal outcome for European foreign policy, in my opinion. So, a lesson for the United States is don't get ahead of yourself. It's great to have whatever goals you have, and I'm not going to comment on the goals. I'm going to comment about respond to your question, but you can't act like the goals are here and you haven't prepared for it. Just like chips, if you want to expand domestic semiconductor production, you don't expand it by becoming more reliant on the Chinese. That puts you in a place where you can be coerced more rather than less. On the EV battery side, the Chinese that are dominant EV battery producers around the world, the final product, they have, because of that domination of the final product, sought to reach out and control graphite, cobalt, you name it, reserves everywhere, certainly including cobalt in the DRC. The general advice for the US government is, if you think this is important, you need to look at the whole supply chain. Otherwise, we're putting ourselves, to the topic of the hearing, in a position where we will be coerced. We have this nice goal, except what it's going to lead to is the goal is dependent on the goodwill of resources controlled by China. That applies to semiconductors, applies to EV batteries, applies to a lot of situations. Don't put the goal, get out in front of yourself and let yourself be coerced more. I will say one final remark. We think DRC is the dominant source of cobalt. We don't look for most minerals in the United States. So we don't actually know what our true rare earth reserves would be, what our true graphite reserves would be, because we don't look. And the reason we don't look is it's not economically practical to mine them. If I had a company to do this and why don't you go look for these reserves? I'm like, well, I'm not gonna mail and mine them and make money. So, I would at least like to know what the true situation in the US is with regard to mineral reserves. That doesn't oblige us to do anything. But if we don't know our true situation because we don't explore, we're in a situation where the DRC has a grip on cobalt, and it is, the Chinese are heavily embedded in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, having some foreign policy problems, but we don't even know what our options are. So general point, think about the whole supply chain before you jump ahead in your goals. And specific point, let's find out what our mineral reserves availability is here.
Very good. You wanted to add something as well?
Yeah, thanks, Congressman Langworthy. This is a critical issue, right? We're transitioning under mandate from the federal government at this point. A huge amount of our vehicles, states are doing it as well, to electric vehicles. There's an effort afoot to shift 174,000 non-tactical DoD vehicles to all electric by 2035. I mean, you think about it, you say, well, it's not tanks, fair enough, but all the supplies that supply all the material will be completely reliant on a supply chain that turns on China. Take cobalt, for example. Happen to know a little bit about it. Serving the advisory board of a U.S. strategic metals company that's actually mining cobalt here in the U.S., refining it here. And what we've identified is that you're right, 70% of the world's cobalt roughly comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. 80-90% plus the world's cobalt is processed in China. Even the cobalt identified in the West, in the U.S., elsewhere, goes overseas to China for processing before it comes back to be put in these electric vehicles. We have got to develop capacity here at home and in our allies to both mine it, but also to refine it. And this is a critical issue if we're going to make this transition. And there are a lot of reasons why the transition doesn't make sense at this time. But if we're going to do it, we cannot be reliant on the Chinese. If they cut our supply of cobalt off, then they decide we're no longer buying electric vehicles from ourselves. We're buying the vehicles themselves from China. That is a net negative. And if we do that for our DoD non-tactical vehicles, we're putting ourselves in a world of hurt.
100%. Mr. Jaffer, could you elaborate on the current debt trap that many sub-Saharan African countries find themselves in with Chinese state-owned banks, and what have been some of the consequences of the so-called debt trap?
Well, this is just another tool of economic coercion. The Belt and Road Initiative by China looked like a development program, right? But in a lot of ways, it has become a trap for these nations. They are taking on huge amounts of loans from China for these infrastructure projects. The Chinese expected to get them repaid. Some of these countries are having challenges, not surprisingly, repaying them, and they're now extorting them for other changes, whether it's policy changes, additional loans, right, extortive interest rates, and the like. And so what looked like a development program, and what at some level was a resource extraction program and a job program for Chinese nationals. I mean, remember, when China goes to a country and they provide loans to build a port, they're not using domestic labor. They're bringing in Chinese labor to work at these facilities, and then they're extracting resources, and then they're charging the country for the benefit of having created this infrastructure. And so these nations are now starting to wake up to the reality of the Chinese debt trap, the reality of the Belt and Road Initiative. The challenge is what options they have. Is the U.S. there? Are our allies there, ready to make commitments and make investments at the scale and scope of the Chinese government? The truth of the matter is we aren't and we haven't been. The answer can't just be, though, U.S. foreign aid. It has to also be us priming the pump, providing incentives to U.S. companies to go invest abroad and provide the kind of low insurance and political risk insurance that we need to allow U.S. companies to go to these nations and engage in the type of commerce that they need and can benefit from that isn't at the extortive processes and debt trap of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative.
Extremely insightful testimony. Thank you. And I think it's clear that this administration, through its push towards dependence on EVs and solar and wind energy, with no eye towards expanding extraction, something House Republicans included in H.R. 1, is complicit in a new imperialism taking hold in sub-Saharan Africa by the Chinese. Chinese economic coercion is not just directed at the United States, it's directed at countries far less developed, far poorer, and far less capable of resisting coercive tactics. And what's worse, though, is that our rising dependence on these minerals and resources to power a Green New Deal appetite and future, we are complicit in these coercive tactics. We're now looking ahead to a new era of misery and stolen economic future for millions as Chinese-run state companies with concessions and other carve-outs extract the rare earth minerals America will be ever more reliant on in the coming years on our current trajectory. China's behavior in Africa and Southeast Asia, it represents a new era of imperialism by a nation that has learned from those who once colonized it. Push countries into indebtedness and economic reliance, then extract resource concessions with little to no benefit for the local economy, and then use the indebtedness and economic concessions as an excuse to seize assets and expand military and political influence. This isn't a this isn't the multipolar future that many in the developed world have spoken for or hoped for, and it certainly isn't the rules-based international community underwritten by the U.S. that has allowed for greater levels of freedom and prosperity than any other time in our world's history. I share the sentiment of my colleagues here today that it's far past time that we take China's global coercive tactics seriously, and it starts with pushing back on disastrous green energy agenda brought here by the Biden administration, relying on these Chinese-sourced lithium, cobalt, and rare earths. And this administration has to be pushed back on because they have shoved this onto the back of the American people. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for having this hearing, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. We've had an unusual day today, which everybody's schedule has been overturned, and I will tell our witnesses, everybody on this committee was here until 12:45 last night after an 8-hour meeting. So I'm not surprised that a few of them decided I've seen enough of this room for today. But I'd like to offer each of you a minute or two to sum up anything you'd like to make sure gets into the record that you think is an important point that we didn't perhaps cover sufficiently in our questions. And then I'll offer a closing reflection, and then we'll be done with the hearing for the day. So I'll start in reverse order, actually. And so, Ms. Wang, we'll start with you for any closing thoughts you might have.
I think I have 2 points to make. One is to follow up on the China's dominance on the supply chain of clean energy. The reason China has such a dominance, one of the big reasons, is precisely because of its human rights abuses. Half of the world's solar panel manufactured in Xinjiang because the labors are free. That's why it's so cheap. So we have to address the forced labor issue. And America already has a law, the Uyghur Forced Prevention Act. So if we effectively enforce it, I think it will put China, not be less dominant in this area because, if companies have to abide by, human rights standards, China can't sell the solar panel for such a cheap price. The second point I really want to make is that, when we use the word China, it's all the Chinese government. The Chinese people hate the zero COVID policy, and the Chinese companies hate the Chinese government's control over them. They want to make profit. They want it to be peaceful. So one thing the U.S. government really should do is to empower the people who's inside the country speak against the Chinese government. Those people, lots of people want democracy, want human rights. How do we support those people? Because ultimately, we want a partner, is democratic, respect human rights, and there are the people who want that as well inside the country. So, investing more to help those people, to empower those people.
Thank you. Great points. Dr. Scissors?
I think two a little bit contradictory points that I'll try to make seem not contradictory because I don't think they really are. Even in this hearing, we've covered a lot of ground. I went off my oral testimony because I just couldn't resist talking about other related issues. And that's a problem for Congress because there's so many things to talk about. And so Senator Schumer has this another try at a comprehensive China legislation. And I wish that luck if it's good legislation. But I don't think Congress should be hung up on we have to solve every major problem with China. So I would encourage the Congress to say, it's all right, we can take a bite out of this is one problem. I know there are other problems. I'm not trying to minimize those, but here's something we can act on. We have bipartisan support. Let's do it. I think picking that out, those specific issues is really important. What I don't think works, and I don't think that's been discussed at all here, but I've seen it elsewhere in the last couple of years, is senses of Congress. No more of those. No more resolutions. China's bad. We got it already. Don't try to solve every problem, but solve a particular problem with real teeth, right? I can't address all 100 of these, but I can pick this one out. I can have a real enforcement mechanism, and we're going to make progress on this issue. So it sounds like I'm saying don't try to do too much and don't try to do too little. There's a happy medium, but I think there is. And I think HR 1135, and I don't mean to say it's a perfect bill because there aren't perfect bills, but it's a bill that says we're not trying to solve every problem in the world, but we have real things we're going to do here. We're going to pick a specific problem, and Congress is going to take action beyond a resolution. I think if we do that, we can take the bipartisan, not consensus, but the bipartisan sentiment on this and start reducing the China problems one at a time, rather than there's going to be a magic solution.
Thank you very much. Mr. Jaffer?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think at the end of the day, what I want the committee to be left with is the notion that the Chinese Communist Party is an adversary. It has been an adversary, and it will remain an adversary for the foreseeable future. We have to treat it as such. We have to hold ourselves, in the government and our companies, our people, responsible when they deal with an adversary, when they give comfort and succor to a nation that and a party that controls a nation that interns a million of its own people, that abuses the religious and privacy and civil liberties of its own people, and then expands that repression, not just in its own region, in the Indo-PACOM, but around the globe, into Africa, into Latin America, and then threatens American companies who cower and hide when those threats come. We have to call that out and hold ourselves, our companies, and our allies accountable. And we have to recognize that at the end of the day, Dr. Cha, Dr. Scissors, and Ms. Wang are right. We cannot do this alone. But that does not mean that we have to concede to the European approach, whatever President Macron might think. We have to bring them to us. They have to realize that they are better off with us than standing alone against China. They will not survive an onslaught from the Chinese economically, politically, or militarily. They have no option but us. And yet the Europeans don't seem to understand that. The more we can bring them around to that understanding, and the more we can bring, as you have here at this committee, and as Congress really has it in almost an unprecedented way, in a time of real challenges in our nation and here in Washington, D.C., has identified an area where there's bipartisanship. This is an opportunity to do the things that Dr. Scissors talks about. Identify those legislative vehicles, move them through. If China things are the only things that get done in this Congress, that's a win. We should take it.
Thank you very much. Dr. Cha?
Well, thank you very much for holding this hearing. Let me just make 2 quick points. The first is that China's, the biggest challenge for us is not the military challenge from China. It is economic coercion, because it affects everything. It affects security, affects human rights, it affects our companies, it affects the liberal international order. The second point I'll make is that the answer to this challenge is about imposing costs on China. Resilience is, sort of creating alternative markets for companies that are targeted, channeling investment to countries that are targeted, that's all fine, but that's defense. We need to be able to play some offense by imposing costs on China for the next time they coerce somebody. That is why I talk about this model of collective resilience. And I think that we cannot do by ourselves. The United States can't do it by ourselves. We need everybody to be working with us, because that's the only way it can be credible to China.
Well, first I want to thank each of you for coming and for your testimony, and it was a refreshing and different hearing for this particular committee, which tends to focus on process and rulemaking, and I think the members enjoyed it, so thank you for your contribution. Second, area we didn't explore, although you all mentioned in different ways, was the importance of friends and allies in this effort, which I do think is a great advantage that we have over China. It doesn't have a lot of friends and allies. It certainly has countries that fear it and respect the power, but we have a much more attractive model, and having spent a lot of time in the Western Pacific, particularly in recent years, we have a lot of people that want to work with us and that see us as critical to their own independence and see the global system that was constructed in the post-World War II era as something that's allowed them to prosper and do well, and worry very much about what might be in place of it. And I'm just really struck by that. I see countries responding out of fear in a military sense in ways, but also anxious to reach out and partner. I will say, and this is only a personal opinion, I think one of the great mistakes in 2016 was the failure of Congress to pass the Trans-Pacific Partnership, where we could have and should have worked together. And I think that fell victim, honestly, to a presidential campaign. The issue was picked up. Clearly, both sides pulled on it because both major nominees rejected it, and that pretty much killed it in Congress. I mean, with all due respect, the Obama administration, which was for it, once the two nominees, one of whom was going to win, were against it, it was pretty much done and finished here. And that was a missed opportunity. But I do think Congress is trying through this select committee on strategic competition between China and the United States, hearings like this, individual pieces of legislation, to actually pick up and find common ground and lead. And I have seen instances before where Congress leads and the administration follows. American history tends to be written the other way, but it's not the way it always works. Quite often, actually, it's the popular assemblies that are ahead of the executive branch, and they pull it in a direction, and then you get more systematic, and consistent follow through in the executive branch. But Congress can actually be the point of the spear on something like this and open it up. And I will end by sharing a very interesting discussion I had not too long ago with some of our very top intelligence officials. And we were talking about this issue of Chinese competition and Chinese sense of destiny and where they're headed. And we were actually asked them, well, do they actually think that history's on their side, that we're a declining power, they're a rising power, and that fortune favors them as we go forward? And the response was very honest and direct, and it was, yes, they do. And then there was a pause and said, but they also think they could be wrong. And he added that and said they remember the United States in the 60s and the 70s when there was this sense of inevitable decline and being eclipsed by Japan or Germany or what have you, or we were going to be on the losing side of the Cold War. And then they remember the 1980s and 90s and a remarkable transformation in America and a remarkable success in the Cold War and an era of American economic vitality and dominance. And I said, the Chinese are astonished at the capacity of the United States to reinvent itself and redirect itself at times when you think things might not look quite so bright. I actually retain that optimism. I have a great deal of faith in our model, a great deal of confidence in the American people. Yeah, if only in the old, alleged Churchill quote, you can always count on the American people to do the right thing after they've exhausted every other possibility. We're pretty good at that over the course of our history, and so I'm pretty optimistic. But I really appreciate your contributions, not only here, but in the broader public dialogue and debate that each of you are in your different ways engaged in. It's really important that the American people hear these kind of discussions, have these kind of ideas put in front of them, and decide what kind of investments, sacrifices, and tools are available to them, and also know that there's not some inevitable military outcome here, that there are measures that can be taken that would spare the world and both peoples anything like that, but allow us to have a more equitable global system and allow our friends, particularly smaller countries that have an enormous stake in the outcome of this. I think the people with the greatest stake of all may be the smallest players in some way, because what kind of world are they going to live in when they're not a great power that can either protect itself or in certain cases impose its own will. But again, your contribution to the dialogue is much, much appreciated, and certainly your time and your talents and your expertise. I have to say this for the record: members shall have 2 legislative days to submit extraneous materials, to revise and extend their remarks, and to submit questions for the record. Thank you. The Rules Committee is adjourned. Get around and thank you all.
A Russian man claiming to hold top-level secrets about Russian advanced bombers has just turned up at the U.S. southern border, seeking asylum. The man claims to have been an engineer at a production facility over in the city of Kazan, and he says that he possesses top-secret information about the White Swan Tu-160, which is the most advanced bomber in the Russian arsenal. U.S. border officials, they interviewed the man, and they determined that his story was in fact credible and eventually passed him off to the FBI, who are still in the process of interrogating him right now. However, analysts have pointed out that the fact that the story was even leaked to the public is an indication that perhaps the American government is encouraging other Russians who also hold top-level secrets to also escape to America. And if you thought that was interesting, well then you should click on that button below this video and check out Epoch TV, one of the best no-censorship video platforms on the internet.